Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Eichhoff, and I serve in the Office of Alumni Relations at John Carroll University. We are excited that you are joining us for this special edition of the JCU Alumni Continuing Education Series, or A.C.E.S for short. A.C.E.S was established in the spring of 2013 by the Office of Alumni Relations in the spirit of lifelong learning. The program offers enrichment opportunities for alumni and friends through the expertise of our members of the JCU administration, faculty, and alumni community. This past summer, we went online with over 900 unique registrations for the summer series. It's safe to say our community has responded. Today marks an important anniversary in the fight for equality and the fight for the vote. 100 years ago, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote throughout the United States. Tonight, we are focusing on the women who worked tirelessly to ensure that they had the same rights as men when it came to being part of our democracy. It is now my honor to welcome and introduce Dr. Malia McAndrew, our featured speaker for this evening's program.
Great, thanks, Eric. Oh, were you going to say something
Yep.
more? All right.
Dr. Malia McAndrew is an associate professor in the Department of History at John Carroll University. She specializes in the history of women and gender in the United States. Dr. McAndrew holds a PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park, and has taught at John Carroll University since 2008. During the 2018-2019 academic year, she was awarded a visiting scholar appointment at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. Dr. McAndrew is the author of several scholarly articles. Her publications have appeared in the Journal of Women's History, the Magazine of History, and other academic outlets. Dr. McAndrew's most recent scholarship chronicles the life of Lieutenant Ethel B. Weed, a Cleveland native who is one of the few American women to devise and implement U.S. foreign policy during the U.S. military occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952. Working alongside noted Japanese feminists, Lieutenant Weed helped bring suffrage and a robust participation in the political process to Japanese women for the first time in that nation's history. At John Carroll, Dr. McAndrew is on the faculty steering committees for the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program, and the Asian Studies program. In 2017, she served as a historical consultant and interviewee for the PBS of the Western Reserve documentary, The Battle for the Right to Vote. Finally, before I turn over to Malia, a quick note about tonight's program. At the conclusion of the moderated portion of the program, you'll have the opportunity to ask Malia questions about tonight's topic. Please use the chat feature to ask questions. We will do our best to get to as many as possible. Additionally, please make sure you're on mute during tonight's program. We will be recording this for individuals who are not able to join us tonight, but we're interested in learning more about the topic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Malia McAndrew.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here with everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to think about women's history and to think about this important centennial. One of the things that I like about Zoom is actually this chat feature that I noticed when we all of our classes had to go online all of a sudden, and I'd never used Zoom before. I realized that all of a sudden people who weren't speaking up in class a lot, like who weren't raising their hand and answering my questions, were like going to town in the chat and were interacting with each other. So I would really encourage you to use this chat function and you can ask questions of me, but you can also have a conversation with each other. We can, decenter me a little bit and let this be a space for everyone who is gathered here today to interact and to think about what we're talking about. So in that spirit, let me ask all of you, could you type just like 1 or 2 or 3 words in the chat? Like when you think of the suffrage movement and when you think of the women in the suffrage movement, what do you think of? Like what words come to your mind? And let's look at the list of the types of things that people think about. So we've got courageous and pioneers. Who else? Awesome. A lot of people see brave. Oh, I like long time ago. It was a long time ago. Determined, empowered, persistent. Heroes. Tenacity and unwavering, passionate, definitely. Great. Okay. All right. Well, we'll continue using this chat. And as I talk, And as I talk about these ideas that you've highlighted, or as I talk about anything else, yes, please continue to put your ideas and your thoughts here. Maybe if there's a question that's pressing that Eric wants me to address as we go on, I can stop and I can address that there. Otherwise, I will definitely take questions at the end of our session tonight. So let's start with what today actually is and what it is that happened 100 years ago. So on August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to approve the 19th Amendment, all right? So the 19th Amendment basically said that the vote cannot be denied or abridged on account of sex, right? As you learn from your basic 101 level political science class, you had to have 3/4 of the states approve an amendment to the Constitution. So first, Congress has to pass the amendment to the Constitution, and then 3/4 of the states have to pass it. And so at that time, there were 48 states, so you needed 36 to approve. Tennessee was the 36th 100 years ago today. Now, technically, there was like a last minute obstructionist move, like as I'm sure you can guess just from watching politics in our own era. And there was an injunction put on the vote, and there was an attempt not to certify it. So it took like another 6 days for it to become official in Tennessee. And then unlike our own era of instant, constant communication, it took 2 days to like ride it on horse all the way down to DC. So another date that people associate with the 100th anniversary is August 26th. So if you're not done celebrating today, you can get back out on August 26th and celebrate. And then of course, this November is the 100th anniversary of women actually using the vote. So on November 2, 1920, about 8 million women went and voted. It was the largest increase in the US voter rolls in US history, the largest single increase. For 144 years, women did not have the right to vote, and then overnight they did. Now, I will qualify that, of course, especially in an era like today, where again, we're grappling with our nation's legacy of racism and classism. In some ways, it was a hollow victory for some communities of women. Native American women, for example, didn't achieve the right to vote until 1924, when that group was formally given citizenship rights in the United States. 1935, Puerto Rican women got the right to vote. One of the very first racist laws in the United States was the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 19th century, which disallowed people from China to become citizens of the United States. So Chinese American women weren't able to vote until 1943. And then, of course, as many of us are familiar with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that allowed Black men and Black women to actually vote in the United States. Although they had the legal rights, a number of kind of obstructionist measures had been put in their path. So as we celebrate the centennial, I think we recognize both its promise and its pitfalls. And so what I'd like to do tonight is to take us through a history of the push for women to vote in the United States. And I'm going to try and do this and give you like the greatest hits of every era, but by all means, feel free. We can follow up on anything specific that people are really interested in if I seem to have gone too fast on anything in particular. Okay, so I think then the first thing that we should notice is that while women did not have the right to vote in the United States when the United States was formed, there is a history of women engaged in the political process in North America previous to the establishment of the United States of America. And so obviously, when you're talking about some 20,000 years, and you're talking about, some 2,000 different language groups, you can't make any sweeping generalizations about voting rights among Native American groups. So I thought that I would just for 1 second kind of key in on a region of the United States that some of you might be in right now. So like the Great Lakes region, particularly upstate New York. I know we have a big John Carroll contingency from the Southern Tier. And so this region of the United States was controlled by what is called the Haudenosaunee Confederation. Some people, it previously used to be called the Iroquois Confederation, but it was a group of 6 different nations. So the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Seneca, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Tuscarora. And these were all matrilineal societies. So they were societies where children belonged to the mother. And when a man and a woman got married, the man would go to live in the wife's family's longhouse. Now, he was still accountable to anything that his mother needed or anything that his sister's children needed in terms of their rearing. But it was matrilineal in the idea that belongings and lineage went through the mother. And so women in this system had political rights and political roles in the Haudenosaunee Confederation. Some people would say that it was, the apex of female political power in this region. They controlled the land. So while men would go out and hunt, women would be in control of agriculture, but they controlled not just the land, but all of the food, whether it was gotten by men or gotten by women. And so sometimes they would withhold food. So if there was a chief that was, too quick to go to war or to do some other thing that they didn't like, they would sometimes control the distribution of food in their favor. They could withhold this from any person at any point. Also, especially older women were seen as elders of the community, and they nominated council members, and these council members who were women could depose chiefs, right? So there was a real political role that they were playing in the society. The society was based on kinship networks, and those kinship networks, which were matrilineal, were tied into the political structure that existed in the Haudenosaunee Confederation. And another reason to mention this confederation is because those Europeans who came to British mainland North America, they often commented on the democratic society that they saw among the Mohawk and the Seneca and the Oneida. And they said, you know what, we want this model of government for ourselves. They felt that England was too hierarchical. They felt that the powers of the hierarchy abused the common man. And they felt that they would be happier if they were a more egalitarian society like the Haudenosaunee, with the exception that they never really mentioned the role of women within the Haudenosaunee Confederation. They saw it as a more egalitarian society, but on gender roles, they didn't see that part, okay? Now, the fact that they didn't see that doesn't mean that nobody in the Americas saw that. And so for many European women who came to the Americas during this period in time, their lives centered around the home first. The home was seen as the woman's sphere and the place where she would exert her influence on the world. And so I don't know about all of you, but the experience of this pandemic and spending a lot more time in my home has just made me so much more in awe of all of the things that women have done in the home over the centuries. I say this with a green screen, which has behind it a sink full of dishes, right? So I feel I'm always cooking or doing dishes. And for women who were in what became the United States around this period of time, European women, I mean, this is what they did all day. They built fires, they kept that fire going. They baked bread, they boiled meat, they made cheese, they made butter, they gathered eggs, they feed the hens, they brewed the beer, they slaughtered the animals, they tended to the vegetable gardens, they sewed clothing, they boiled the laundry after you wore the clothing. Then maybe you would go to the store and you would sell some surplus eggs or surplus milks that you had, and maybe you would trade it with another woman for cloth that she had woven, right? So you're doing this all day, all week long. And on top of this, you're doing it probably pregnant or nursing, because there was a 2 to 3 year cycle that women were constantly on in this time period. And as women from the African continent came to the United States, oftentimes they still had these domestic roles in addition. I mean, that the domestic roles were just their side job, right? In addition to doing work on cash crops that was foisted upon them, all right? So many women in the early United States, didn't have a lot of time to think about politics. Their life was centered on the home, and men, their lives were supposed to be the lives of politics and business and the economy. So the very first women to get involved in the movement oftentimes were women from what we might call the leisure class or the learned class. They were white women who didn't have to make all this bread and slaughter all these animals and tend to all these vegetables, but like had the ability to do things like read books, right? And they started to read books like Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, which argued that women's rights were human rights. That's a link that we see throughout the suffrage movement, of human rights and women's rights being together. She said that women should be on the same footing as men. Particularly, she wanted to see that in terms of education. And she felt that if women had an adequate education, then they wouldn't be second-class citizens, that they would be able to achieve the same things that men achieved in society. And so this, among the early national period, those first kind of what we're going to call like mainstream suffragettes, this is kind of the thinking that they're having. And they wouldn't have called themselves suffragettes. And so I want to be clear about that. Even like in 1917, like right before women officially won the right to vote, suffragettes was actually a term associated with like really militant women's rights activists in the UK. And so many people in the movement in the United States kind of shunned that term or used it playfully, suffragettes. But, it's kind of like the word feminist, where, how we use it today isn't necessarily, people didn't necessarily accept it in their own lives. Okay, so going back to the early national period, these learned women who are starting to pass around ideas. Since the formation of the United States, there were those women who argued that women should have political and legal rights as citizens. So when the revolution happened, there was a question of like, would this just become a war for independence? Like, is the United States just like breaking off from England and this is a war of independence? Or is this actually a revolution? Are we revolutionizing the way our society exists? Are we creating this robust democratic system that the world had not been used to? And so one woman who some of you might have heard about is a woman by the name of Abigail Adams. And some of you from maybe your history classes have heard about the letters that she wrote to her husband. So back in the day, before people text messaged or WhatsApped their spouses, they would write them long letters, right? And so while John Adams was off with the Continental Congress, while he's like literally starting to figure out how the United States is going to declare itself, she is writing him letters and is telling him her opinion about this sort of thing. So let me show you just a few of her letters, and you can get a sense of some of these early arguments that women were making about the vote. So here they are, the good-looking couple themselves. So she writes to him, she writes to John on March 31st, 1776, and she says this to him. And again, like, feel free to use the chat here, like what you hear her saying, like let other people know what you think this means, what you think it represents. Like I definitely don't have to be the only voice on the interpretation of these letters. But she says to him, and I'll read this, and I'm sharing it just so everybody can see it as well. She says, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established. Willingly give it up. Give up the harsh tide of master for the more tender and enduring one of friend. Men of sense in all ages abhor these customs, which treat us only as servants of your sex. Regard us then as being placed by providence under your protection, in imitation of the Supreme Being, making use of that power only for our happiness. All right. So she is clearly making an argument. I mean, she's saying, like, when you go and you make your independence, when you create this new United States and you create the laws, I think it's necessary that, like, you remember the ladies and you be a little more favorable to them than men had previously. Okay, so this is my question for you, and you can put your answer in the chat if you so wish. What do you think he said? How do you think he responded? How do you think a man in the late 1770s responded to his wife when she basically tells him, you know, what to do with his life's work? What do you think? Anybody have any ideas? Yes, dear. If he had only said yes, right? And then, like, that was it. There's nothing else to worry about in the United States. Okay, so let's look at his response. So he says, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bonds of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent in their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, have grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy. So, I mean, he's flirting with her a little bit. And, you know, but on top of that, he's also talking about what was a critique of the revolution, that if this was not just a war for independence, like, how revolutionary would this new country be? Like, would we topple the power hierarchy that previously existed? And there were those in the United States, women and African Americans and Native Americans and other marginalized groups, who believed that they did have a place in this new United States. Now, we know, as people who live in 2010, we live in 2020, we know that this didn't happen, right? But the fact that somebody like a Crispus Attucks, an African American runaway slave, was one of the first people to die in the Boston Massacre, right? The fact that somebody who himself was not free was one of the first people to die for the cause of American freedom suggests that there were those in the United States who felt like this would be a more robust revolution, and that Abigail was one of those people, and she's pushing on her she's pushing on her husband. So after he calls her saucy, he goes on and he says, "We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We do not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly in practice. You know, we are the subjects," right? He's saying, oh, you know, you're the real boss, honey. "We have only the name of masters, and rather than give this up, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all of our brave heroes will fight," right? So he doesn't want the despotism of the petticoat, as opposed to the despotism of the King of England. All right, so I will finish up. I will let her have the last word. I will not let him have the last word on this particular issue, and then we'll go into the next period of U.S. history. But this is what she says in response to him. She says, "I cannot say that I think you are very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxim, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence, throw both your natural laws and your legal authority at our feet." All right, so I think she's pretty clear in her desires for this new nation that she wants to see created. He doesn't respond to her directly in this letter. He eventually responds to a friend of his in another letter where he basically says He doesn't really think that women had the capacity to vote, like to reason and to vote. And so, you know, it was a null point for him. It doesn't seem like the other founders were that interested in it. And so we know that women are not enfranchised with other citizens. And even most men during this time period weren't enfranchised. I mean, you had to be kind of an elite property owner to be involved in politics at this period of time. Okay, so I'm gonna stop my screen share just so that you can see me again, and I can talk to you a little bit more about this trajectory that's going on. So the United States is formed. There are some within the mainstream kind of elite, middle class, upper middle class circle who are starting to advocate for more roles for women. They don't want voting rights yet. Okay, but here's the thing. When the United States is formed, democracy is not like a very popular system of government, right? And people don't know how to be democratic citizens, right? Because whereas being subject to a king, you just do what the king says. If you're going to live in a democracy, then you have to like be informed. You have to know about the debates that are going on. You have to be able to weigh evidence. You have to be able to think about it in conflicting interpretations, and you have to vote for what you think is going to be in the interests of a nation. So how are people going to go from just, I do as I say, to being kind of discerning voters, right? So this is where women came in. And there became, during this early national period, the idea of Republican motherhood, right? That the ideal woman, yes, her role was still considered to be mainly in the home, right? But in addition, it was believed that she had to learn how to do things like read and write and become literate and rational, because the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. That she was going to be responsible for teaching young boys about their citizenship duties and creating this great republic. And so that if women were ignorant, their little boys would be ignorant, and then the leaders of the nation would be ignorant. And so this was like a first step for women into the world of politics, this Republican motherhood ideal, right? So we're talking, you know, late 1700s, early 1800s, right? The next generation of women took this a step further, and they extended themselves from the home into the public sphere in new ways by saying, listen, just like I am responsible for being a good mother and making sure my sons and daughters are ethical, moral people, and just as I use my ideas of morality and my mothering and nurturing nature in the home, I should also do that for society at large. We have problems in society. For example, prostitution is a great ill in society. Like, that should not be allowed to exist. Men are being very immoral in this pursuit. And so I need to get involved in society for things like prostitution to bring my womanly sentiments to an issue that men are ignoring. And so you see all these women in the early 18th century who start to become activists, and they're basing it and they're justifying it in their roles as mothers and as nurturers, and they're doing, as I said, anti-prostitution campaigns, public education campaigns, public health campaigns, like sanitation in cities, and moral reforms during this era. And so you see many more women enter political arenas during this period in time, although not asking for the right to vote, but still being political citizens during this period of time. Okay, so it was during this period of time that there was a young girl by the name of Elizabeth Cady, and she was growing up in New York State. And Elizabeth Cady was the daughter of Judge Cady, and oftentimes, like, supposedly her mother would get exasperated with her and just say, like, go visit your father, go bother your father for a little while. And so she would spend a lot of hours like sitting outside of her father's office and listening to him talk to different clients and different people. And so one day her father was in his office by a woman named Flora Campbell. And Elizabeth knew Flora Campbell because Flora like worked for the family, like on the side. She did little side jobs for the family, but she did a lot of like side jobs around town, and she made some good money for herself. And so Flora is talking to the judge, and she's saying, you know, Judge, like I used all my money that I've been saving up, and I've been saving up years, and I bought this small farm, right? And the farm is going well, like it's turning a profit. But unfortunately, my husband died. And when my husband died, he bequeathed this farm that I worked so hard to make all the money for, he gave it to my son. And my son is like a no good drunk. My son is like reckless and, you know, is up to no good. And I want my farm back. How do I get my farm back? And so Judge Katie, you know, he listens to her. He's sympathetic, but he kind of softly explained, like, there's nothing that I can do. Like, legally, your property, your earnings, they're legally your husband's. You know, this is the law. You don't really own this property. You know, your husband owned it, and now, unfortunately, your son owns it. And so Flora leaves the office. She's like sobbing, she's crying, and Elizabeth watches this, and she like wants to do something about it, right? Like something is spurred in her soul to take care of this. So like she hatches her first brilliant idea. And later that day, she snuck into her father's legal office, and she took down the book from his legal books. And she found the book that he had been showing to Flora, and she tried to tear out the pages where, you know, it was talking about property rights. And so unfortunately, her father caught her, and he kind of like explained how things worked, that, you know, the law still exists independently of the books on the shelf. But she was inspired, as many women of this generation were inspired by the inequities that they saw in society, to try and change things. And so obviously, as you can guess, Elizabeth Cady becomes Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, when she comes of age, is one of the founders of the Seneca Falls Convention. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott convene in 1848 a convention of women in New York State, of women and of men who all want to address this human rights issue. And so even, you know, it was kind of like a popular who's who of people in New York during that period in time. So even people like Frederick Douglass attended, and they signed the Declaration of Sentiments, and they really pushed a new argument that was being forwarded for the first time, that they basically took the Declaration of Independence and they changed, like, you know, 2 words. They say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, right? And they made, and it was actually Frederick Douglass who really pushed that they say, like, yeah, this means voting rights too, because that was such a radical ideal at that time. Not even everybody at that convention was willing to sign on to the idea of women's rights. Eventually 68 of the women and 32 of the men signed on to it. But if you can see like a small shift that's now going on here between, like, in those early eras, women were basically saying we should become political actors because of our identity as women. Like, because we are women, we are more moral, we are more pious. And we should use like our morality and our pious nature to like mother society and be great mothers for society. So they were justifying their action in politics on their differential status as women, right? And what you see in Seneca Falls, like the reason why that's important and why people often point to Seneca Falls is because like this is a fundamentally different argument, that they're saying, you know, women should have the right to vote because men and women are equal, right? And this is really a debate that never really gets settled. It kind of ebbs and flows throughout US history and really in between different groups at the same period of time, or whether or not we should peg women's rights on a differential status. Like, you know, later in the early 20th century, when you had a lot of immigrants coming to the United States, and many of them didn't, I think in like 1915, like 15% of the population of the United States was immigrant. And there were a lot of people who were being put to work in sweatshops, and they were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I'm sure you're familiar with things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, where basically the employer locked the doors because he thought the women workers, they might leave early. So he locked the doors, and when a fire broke out, they died. And so there was during this 20th century, again, this debate about like, how do we get women's rights? Like, we need to protect these women workers, all these women who are working in these textile mills. And should we pass things like child labor laws or laws against the employment of women in inequitable situations to say, like, listen, women shouldn't have to work 12 hours a day, right? Should we base that on the idea of saying, like, there is something about their womanly nature that they should be able to go to the home, right? And so, or should we be arguing that, you know, women have rights, women's rights are human rights, and this is something that we want all citizens to have the right to, which would have been a harder sell, all right? So this distinction is coming up, I'm saying, during the mid-19th century, really for the first period of time. I will mention one of the most prominent people at the Seneca Falls Convention was a woman by the name of Sojourner Truth. Some of you might be familiar with, but she basically spent the first 30 years of her life in bondage. She too was a New Yorker. I don't mean to talk so much about New York, but it was one of the hotbeds of political activism, particularly in suffrage. And I know that we have a lot of people in the John Carroll community who are from this area. So she was born in New York. Her first language was Dutch, because before New York was New York, it was New Amsterdam. And she, after New York outlawed slavery, she became an itinerant preacher and a women's rights activist, right? So very much like other women and men who went to Seneca Falls, she really wanted to drive home this point about men and women being created equal, and the idea that women couldn't vote is just being complete BS. Because during this period in time, there were a lot of people who said, like, women are too dainty to vote, right? Like, they're too docile of creatures. They're meant to be loved and taken care of in the home. And to be true, like, politics was pretty nasty in the 19th century. Like, when people went to vote, like, you know, today you think about like going to your local elementary school and voting. Like, back then people went to the saloon / barber shop where like everybody was drunk and rowdy, and that's where you voted, right? And so some people were like against women's voting because they didn't like think like this place was like a place for women. I mean, I know like there was even like this one group in Baltimore called like the Blood Tubbers, and like you would go and you would vote, and like if they didn't think you voted with the way that the party machine was voting, they would like take these guys and they would like dip them in lamb's blood and then like throw them into the streets, kind of like a tarring and feathering, saying to anybody else who thought that they might go and vote in that way that like that wasn't a good idea. Okay, so there were those who were arguing that like the world of politics is nasty and dirty, and that is not the place for the beautiful, delicate flower that is the woman, right? All right, so Sojourner was not having that, all right? And basically, the speech that she gave, and she gave a speech in 1851, right in Akron, Ohio, and it was where they had like another women's rights convention. Like, they kept having these women's rights conventions all over. And the speech that she gave there is probably one of the more famous speeches of the women's movement. But basically she said, and I'll quote from her, she says, "I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and moved, and can any man do more than that?" I mean, she basically lays out in this speech, she said, listen, I was enslaved. Nobody ever said that like I was too dainty or a little flower when I was enslaved. You seem to be able to make me haul a lot then. So, you know, it's kind of silly now that you're saying that I don't have the capacity to vote. This speech became familiarized. There's a refrain which historians aren't really sure if she said at that time, but she basically laid out, you know, all the things that she had ever done in her life of being the mother of children, of being a worker, being a laborer, and then the refrain was, "And aren't I a woman?" And so making that forceful argument for women's rights. So Sojourner is part of this generation of women who are really starting to for the first time, argue that women need to have the right to vote based on equality of the sexes, all right? And within this, this movement, there are many sub-movements, all right? So like, as you can guess, in any social movement, it's not like everybody just stands together and sings Kumbaya, here we are, like we all love each other, right? Like these women in the women's rights movement sometimes fought with each other to the bitter end. And there were multiple organizations that sometimes would like do spying and recon on the other organizations because they thought like their way of achieving women's rights was the best way. The movement was also, the mainstream white movement was also incredibly racist and classist. You know, it's imbued with those same hierarchies that you would expect to be happening within the United States. But if I can kind of generalize for you a lot of what was going on in this second half of the 19th century, you know, the movement basically breaks down into two camps during this period of time, right? There are those who want the state-by-state approach and those who want the national approach, all right? So by this period of the late 19th century, there is a full-on push among suffragettes to get women the right to vote. So how should we physically do that, right? Some people argued, let's go through the states, right? And in particular, there were a lot of places in the western part of the nation that were territories, that were becoming states. And, you know, these were like emerging societies. It wasn't like the East Coast that was like very like set in its ways and hierarchical, and the same people who had been in power had always been in power. In the West, like, if you could rope and ride and run your own farm, then, you know, yeehaw, welcome, welcome. And so like you see Wyoming in 1869 grant women the right to vote. And then when it became a state in 1890, it transitioned as well. And so then there's the same thing happens in Colorado, in Utah, in Idaho, that in many of these states, women had the right to vote in that state. So long before 1920, there are women who are enfranchised in these states. And that's what some of the suffragettes think. They say like, listen, we need to do this on a state-by-state campaign. And then once women have power in these states, then we have kind of like this critical mass of people who can lobby things at the national level. And so they put like all their money and resources, the groups that supported this did, into like door-to-door campaigns in these states where like they literally knocked on people's doors and talked to them about women's suffrage and would you be willing to vote for a state amendment for women's suffrage. They would go to state fairs. In Massachusetts, one of the really popular things was like trolley rides. So the suffragettes would get on trolleys and the trolley would ride from like city to city to city. And as soon as it stopped at the station, they would give like impromptu speeches on like, here's why women need the right to vote in Massachusetts. So they would go and talk to local politicians and they would say, you know, they'd make appeals like you do to any politician. They say, you know, I've got this widow. She's just got a ton of cash. She really doesn't want anything, Senator so-and-so, except, you know, she'd like it if she donated to your campaign and you supported votes for women, right? And so that was one of the strengths of this campaign is that you were able to lean on local ties. You were able to lean on local power hierarchies. You were able to educate local citizens about their government, encourage local people to take charge of their communities, to become active in their communities. And that's why some people wanted the state-by-state approach. Now, the weakness of this strategy is that it took a really, really, really long time, okay? Between 1870 and 1910, there were 480 little campaigns all across the United States to get women the right to vote in a local or a statewide election. That led to a whopping 17 state referenda on women's suffrage. And of those 17 states that voted on the issue, only 2 states ended up securing voting rights for women. So some people just thought like, listen, this is nice, but this is just taking way too long. And what we want is like in one foul swoop, we want all women to be able to vote, Okay, so that's then the second strategy that really existed in the second half of the 19th century. There are those who want the state-by-state approach, and they have a lot of victories, especially at the beginning, especially in the West. But at a certain time, it stalls out, and there's a certain stalemate. And there's this sense that we could keep playing we could have to play chess in 42 billion little communities for the rest of our life. Wouldn't it be just easier if there was one national amendment? And so that's where you see women like Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth just to decide, like, you know what? I think the Constitution already gives me the right to vote. I think I am a citizen, and I think I can vote. And so both Sojourner and Susan B., they went and they voted in 1872. And then, of course, as many of you know the story, they were struck down in the courts, that eventually the court said that their actions were not lawful and that women were not, did not have the authority to vote, right? But like originally, like I know they say, like with Susan B. Anthony, like when she went in Rochester, she was like the woman of Rochester, and like she just kind of like showed up by surprise one day. And I guess like the three election officials who were like at this station were kind of like young and inexperienced guys, and they kind of like didn't want to tell her no. And so like they let her register to vote, and then she voted. But then things catch up, right? And she is charged with voter fraud and you know, and all of this. And as we know, the story goes on. And so then the movement says, all right, let's work for this national amendment. Let's work for this 19th Amendment, and let's get a national solution for women to get the right to vote. And we get one thing that will just solve it for all of the nation. Okay, so obviously there is strength in that, of this idea that you can do one thing and it's going to get women everywhere the right to vote. But the problem with this strategy is that, as you can guess, like anytime the federal government says everybody has to do this before it's settled in local communities, there's often great backlash. And there will be people who will be fighting in the streets saying, the federal government can't tell me to do this, right? And so that the people who, you know, continue to push the state-by-state approach says, you know, you're just setting women up for failure. You're setting us up for a national backlash, because if we come down with an amendment that all of the states don't support, particularly in places like the South, you're going to get them to reject this. When the 19th Amendment was, as we said before, the 19th Amendment, you needed 3/4 of the states in order for it to be ratified. So you needed 36 states to approve it. Of those 36 states, Tennessee was one of only 4 southern states to approve this. And so, you know, the states' rights argument was something that people feared, and they feared that it would be a real detriment to the movement. Okay, so in the late 19th century, there is all of this debate going on within the women's movement of, do we do state by state? Do we do national? And like some women, and particularly a younger generation of women, they just get fed up with it, and they decide that they are going to forward a new strategy. And some of their leadership goes to places like England, and they learn about the strategy that women are using there. And it is a much more militant strategy. It is a strategy that is meant to produce a reaction in people, like a visceral reaction. And they decide that they're going to stop working within the system and trying to like lobby congressmen and talk to elected officials and playing nice little suffragette girl. And they're going to take it to the streets, right? Whatever party was in power, they blamed that party and they protested against that party. So when Woodrow Wilson was elected president of the United States in 1914, the day before his inauguration, they scheduled a counter inauguration. They scheduled a women's rights march. And they said, you know, we don't support you as president. And so they brought women and they marched on that day, but then they brought it right to the White House and they protested and they picketed in front of the White House. And today, I think we take for granted that strategy. Today, it might almost seem like pretty like, oh, wow, you're picketing in front of the White House. But it had never been done before these women had did it. And they were doing it during a time of war, right? So they're getting blowback, and people are saying, you know, you're not even patriotic, right? You're not supporting our nation at a time of war. And like, and on top of the, like, you're not patriotic thing, like if you study World War I, you know, like civil liberties were curtailed during World War I, right? Like it became very dangerous to speak out against the US government. But these women, they stood with their signs, and they marched, and they said, you know, Mr. President, when will you allow women the right to vote? And so what I'm saying is, like, this third strategy that this newer, younger generation really put forward, and I'm saying by like 1917, people had gotten sick of the old, should we go national or state by state? And this certain group of people learned from their sisters in England, who, you know, the women in England were doing things like arson and public protest, and it, you know, it was a very provocative campaign. And so when women had picketed the White House, basically what eventually got them in trouble was there were those who kind of grew irritated with what they were doing or didn't support it, and they kind of like bum rushed the women, and they tried to take their signs away, and a scuffle ensued. And actually, you know, scuffles ensued even with these various women's rights marches and parades that they would have. Sometimes those nonviolent direct action public protests would devolve into riots, right? Because there were also like a lot of guys standing around who were like drunk and wanted to be rowdy, right? And so like some people really started to not like these suffragettes and what they were doing. They thought that they were just there to cause problems in society. And so eventually, and historians think that it was at the instruction of President Wilson, the local police in front of the White House came and arrested the women, and the charges against them was that they were obstructing traffic. Okay, so basically, the police say you obstructed traffic. They took them in. They said, you know, you're going to have to pay a fine. The women said, we are not paying your fine. We were not obstructing traffic. You arrested us and punished us because of our political beliefs, and we will take no part in this. For which they were sent to jail, or actually it was the Occoquan workhouse that they were sent to, which had horrible, abysmal conditions. The food had worms. It was leaking. People were getting sick from the grotesque, wet, damp living conditions they were in. And for her obstruction of traffic, Alice Paul, the leader of the movement, was given 7 months in this workhouse. And so after about 3 weeks, she basically said, you know, this is unfair. I am being held as a political prisoner. And she goes on a hunger strike. And many of the other women go on a hunger strike as well. And the officials in charge, they don't think it would be good if one of these women died of hunger while in prison. And so they started force feeding them 3 times a day. And in order to do that, they had the women committed to the psychiatric ward of the workhouse of the prison. You know, they put a tube down their nose and forced them to eat 3 times a day. And so, you know, it actually had the effect of, when the press heard about this, there were many who then the backlash came in kind of sympathy for the women, and like, why were the women being treated in this way? And then all of a sudden, you know, Alice Paul's sentence of 6 months got like reduced, and she was let out after 5 weeks or something like that. So part of the final push for women's rights came only after this younger generation was willing to draw support for their cause in new ways and were able to launch new tactics. The strength of this was that it did open people's eyes. It grabbed people's attention. People who weren't following the news before were following it now, after you have thousands of women marching in cities and news of things like these force feedings. The drawback was that it turned some people off, right? As we said before, that some people came to see these women as rabble rousers, as no good people who just wanted, who were communists, who were anarchists, who wanted to cause trouble in society. And it actually made the women's rights advocates who were talking about the states' rights approach or the national approach, it made them seem like really reasonable people, right? Who maybe we can do business with those other women, right? Maybe we should talk to them. So, you know, that brings us to 1920, to when Congress finally passes the 19th Amendment. When you have these 48 states approve, you know, it's not just urban legend. The last vote in Tennessee was going to be by a man who was going to vote no, but his mother said not to come home unless he voted yes. So that last vote that tipped him was a little bit of domestic politics that swayed that. But as I said before, you know, at the beginning, for 144 years, women didn't have the right to vote. And then overnight they did. And 8 million women voted for the first time that year. And so I guess, you know, I'll leave us with this, and thank you for listening to this probably too long discussion. I'm sorry, I like to nerd out on this topic and a lot of other topics. But I guess I'll leave you with this. Like, I can't even imagine, like, a lot of these women, like Susan B. Anthony, worked in the movement for like 50 years, and they died like years and years before suffrage was ever made. And you know, like, I think back on their life, and you're sorry that they didn't live that just a little bit longer. But I think maybe one of the positives is that it, you know, and this is just my opinion, that it reminds all of us who believe strongly in something today, you know, whatever issue you're interested in, sometimes if you measure yourself on like, what did I achieve today, or what did I achieve in my lifetime, maybe we just make our rule of measure a little bit longer, and we see ourselves as people who are interested in generational change, right? It took 44 years. It took more than one generation of women to get women the right to vote in the United States. And so maybe that's the thing that will console me when I feel like nothing is ever changing. Okay, so with that, I will pass it back over to Eric.
Malia, thank you so much for walking us through that history. It's really, it's really inspiring to see how many people were involved in this movement and where we started and where we are now. So thank you again. I'm going to let some people put some questions in the chat feature, but I did have a couple questions for you. One that kind of hit me in anyone, you had mentioned upstate New York a little bit. I know that's where the number of the Native American tribes you mentioned are in upstate New York. Did the suffragettes, so like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and people in Seneca Falls, draw inspiration from the Native Americans who gave women a more full part of their society?
I don't have any evidence that they even knew about it, right? Wow. That, I mean, and maybe somebody can find an obscure letter and prove me wrong, but I think, you know, as was said, as like a lot of these women had the same assumptions about people of other races and other classes that people of their time period held, and felt like Native American groups were, you know, uncivilized groups of people who had never really contributed anything to the world. And so it is so interesting that exactly where the Seneca and the Cayuga and the Onondaga women were exerting their power is the exact same place where Seneca Falls was. And I don't have any knowledge that these white suffragettes and Black suffragettes of the 1840s knew anything about the Native American experience. Okay.
Sorry to just bring that, you know, it kind of just hit me as you were talking about all of it. Like, it just seemed like it was so natural being in Rochester with Susan B. Anthony and Seneca Falls. Mm-hmm. What do you think the suffragettes would think about the current health of our own electoral process, and, you know, as it specifically relates to the overall participation of our citizens? Do you think they'd be happy with where we are? Do you think they'd be disappointed knowing how much they fought for it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is where, you know, I go from historian to, you know, talking outside of my discipline. So I would love to hear in the chat what other people think that the suffragettes would have thought today. Like, it is interesting to think about, like, if women who are part of this movement were around today, you know, what would they think? Part of me says, you know, these are women who didn't just talk the talk, they walked the walk. And so, you know, I spend a lot of time like thinking and reading about women's rights, but they were out there on the front lines, like at a time that it was not it was not the norm for women to be politicking in the ways that they did. And so I think that they would be very interested, I'm guessing, in issues today that would in any way limit the vote, right? I mean, there are, and again, like, this is just my opinion, but like there are women in the United States who still don't have full voter rights, whether it's because they live in the District of Columbia, they're convicted felons. There are a number of people who still don't enjoy full voting rights. So, but I don't know. Again, I'm happy if other people disagree to hear other people's opinions.
One question, I know we have a lot of parents who are on the call tonight, and you were so gracious to do the JCU Junior for us that we launched today, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. If parents want to learn more about how to educate their children on women's suffrage or the suffragettes, where would you recommend them go to find resources on this topic?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in general, one of the things that draws people to history are stories. And so that's always a good place to start is helping children to learn stories of great women who inspire them. And so, it can be a little bit of a hunt of finding different women's voices, women who represent communities that you're particularly that you're a member of from a state that you're a part of, and kind of like investigating that, even looking back into your own family history and saying, like, what did grandma do? What did great grandma so-and-so think? And so that's one way to engage kids. But actually, I'm going to throw this question back at you, Eric, because if people don't know, he's like America's #1 suffrage dad. Like, they fly the suffrage flag. They've gone to like Seneca Falls. So I unfortunately don't have children, but you are so blessed with 2 daughters, I believe. So what do you think, Eric?
Yeah. We've taken our daughter to both Seneca Falls, which is really an amazing place. We've gone up to Rochester to Susan B. Anthony's home, which is still there, in her grave. And I remember going after the last national election, and seeing everyone putting their "I voted" stickers on Susan B. Anthony's grave. Ironically enough, Susan B. and Frederick Douglass are actually buried in the same cemetery up in Rochester. And then we went to the Alice Paul House in Washington, D.C., which a lot of people don't necessarily know it's there. It's kind of tucked by the Supreme Court, and another great place to go. So I would look at the national parks for sure. Mm-hmm. And I know the Girl Scouts have some stuff out there right now too.
Yeah. Yeah. Kids are interested in what their parents are interested in. So if you're interested in it as an adult, you're going to spur that curiosity in your children.
So Robert has a question about how uniform was the support for the suffrage movement amongst women? Was it, were there counter groups saying, no, we don't want the vote? And what was that dynamic like, if there were those between the suffragettes and maybe the other groups?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because women are a very diverse group. And just like today, all women do not think the same, right? Some women are Democrats, some women are Republicans, some women support this legislation, some women don't. And so there was never a time when all women thought the same, right? I would say of any movement in United States history, this is the one where more women were likely to be a part of it. But there were definitely women who were part of the anti-suffragette campaign. And so, or the no campaign. And so you can imagine, for a man to be part of the no campaign, maybe he just didn't want to see this right extended to women. But why is a woman who was interested enough in politics to become part of a political campaign, why would that campaign be the no campaign, right? Wouldn't a woman interested in politics be more likely to support the yes campaign? So one of the arguments, going back to something that I said before, one of the arguments that people made was that just the world of politics was an incredibly corrupt and spoils system type of place. And some people didn't want women to be drawn down into the mud. Some people who were part of the no campaign argued that no, women do have real work to do in society. A lot of the people who helped to get alcohol banned in the United States were part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, right? Which has its roots here in Northeast Ohio. and they would just say, listen, like, we can do more in the world of politics, working outside of this dirty system of voting that will only bring us down. And so that, I mean, I don't know that you buy that argument as somebody living in 2020, but that was one of the things that they argued, that they didn't want women to vote because voting was like a debased thing anyway, and they could have more sway in society by working through these other levers of power that they were working through.
Okay. And then actually another question from Robert, which I think is really interesting. Going kind of into the same groups, were there different religions that felt differently? So as a Catholic Jesuit institution, did Catholics feel one way? Did people of the Jewish faith feel another way? Was it like a uniform block, or was it kind of just spread across the spectrum?
Yeah, I don't want to I think like any group, right? Just like we can't say like all women believed a certain thing. We can't say like all Catholics or all Jewish people or all, any group believed a certain way. Certainly in terms of Catholic women tended to be members of the more conservative wings of the women's suffrage movement. And working through that way, but there were definitely those on the anti side and on the con side. I don't know personally as much about religious history to talk too much at length about this, but I will say that in the 19th century, for much of history, right, in the United States, people didn't live to be happy, right? For many people, and for women living during this time period of the 19th century, they lived to serve God. Their religion was very, very important to them. And so for many women of any religion, they drew upon their religion as inspiration to do what they thought was the right thing, that many of them thought they were doing God's work, right? To go back to Sojourner Truth. She was both itinerant preacher and women's rights activist, and she saw them in the same vein.
Giovanna asked, actually not specifically about this topic, 1920 and the centennial, but she was interested about your research on Lieutenant Ethel Weed. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Oh my gosh, you guys are so nice. Thank you for even caring about this. I have been studying this girl's life forever, and she is the Clevelander. I need to write some op-ed to the Cleveland Plain Dealer. She is somebody who's really just amazing. So she was born in 1902. She was born in Syracuse, but the family moved to Cleveland. She went to Lakewood Public High School. She went to Case Western Reserve and got her degree there. And then she started working in public relations. So she worked as a public relations consultant for women's clubs. There was a women's city club of Cleveland back then. And there were, different women's organizations and orders. And she would do, if they had an event, she would do publicity campaigns for them. So when World War II started, a new group came to her, the United States Army. And the United States Army said, we think we need women to win this war, because while men are going away and fighting, there are a lot of women who we think have knowledge and skills that we can tap into. This is now a technological war. And so being, an airplane spotter or a mathematician who is going to compute the trajectile of different weapons and that sort of thing. The United States government wanted to start using highly qualified, highly educated women. And there is this movement to get women to join the military, but the military was seen as this very kind of masculine thing. So when they came to Northeast Ohio, they came to this woman by the name of Ethel Weed, and they're like, Ethel, sell it for us, right? And so she becomes incredibly effective with this. And so much so that they turn around and they say to her, would you want to maybe become a member of the military? So she joins the United States Army. She then, as the war proceeds, she's kind of tapped for jobs where the United States government wants to start training her for the post-war world, that the United States decided that if they were so lucky as to win the war, they would need to go to other places like Japan and Germany, which, are being decimated with things like fire bombs, and civil society is being worn down. And the United States government is probably going to have to do things just build roads and infrastructure again. And so they're training these like bureaucrats to run these occupations. Okay, so Ethel is one of 4 women who goes to this officer training school with really a bunch of men, and learns how to do this work, the work of a military occupation. And she's sent to Japan after the war. And what MacArthur says to her is, women had never voted in Japan before, right? And MacArthur decides that the men of Japan, they were the kamikaze fighters. They were the bonsai infantrymen. Like, they were never going to be on the side of the United States. And the United States wanted to like convert the Japanese people from like this military foe to a familiar friend, because now in the Cold War, it was Russia, it was the Soviet Union that was seen as the problem. So it quickly wants to make the Japanese people turn into this ally in the Asia Pacific region, as like the place in Asia that the United States plans can launch from. And so MacArthur says, like, we don't have a chance with the men, so maybe we should look to women, right? And MacArthur pushes forward the women of Japan, enfranchises the women of Japan to vote for the first time. And he basically says, Ethel, get them to vote with American interests in mind, okay? So Ethel Weed shows up in Japan. She has 6 months of language training. She knows nothing about Japanese culture and history. And so what does she do? She aligns herself with 1920s Japanese feminists, women who had been thrown in jail in the 1920s in Japan, just like Alice Paul and them had been thrown in jail in the United States. She finds their contemporaries in Japan, because the women's movement in the 1920s was a global movement. And so she talks to women like Kato Shizue, and many of these really prominent Japanese feminists, and she brokers this really interesting deal between these kind of radical left-wing feminist activists and this like top-down military occupation, and they work together to enfranchise women to vote for the first time in Japan in 1946. So I talked too long on that one too, but sorry, nobody ever asked me about my research. And she's a Cleveland girl, so I thought I'd mention it.
How did you find out about her? Did it something?
I was researching a previous article, and like she kind of came up, and like it piqued my interest because I found out that like her office was in the same building as the Starbucks that I go to. And so like I was just like kind of interested in her. I started learning about her, and I had published an article where I mentioned her. And then like out of the blue, like her nephew emails me, and he's like, I was like Googling my aunt online. I came up with your name, and like I have these 6 boxes full of her letters. Like, would you be interested in them at all? And I was like, like every historian's dream, right? Like the box of letters that nobody's ever seen before. And so, yeah, that's what I've been doing in recent years is going through all of that and making her story known. She's actually really well known in Japan. People there know her. It's in the United States. We don't know her as well.
Well, that's a phenomenal story, and that's awesome that you're able to shed light to it. So one last question from Terry Lewandowski. She said, I think you mentioned that Sojourner Truth registered to vote. Did she try to vote, and was she arrested for it, similar to Susan B. Anthony?
She attempted to vote. So that's my understanding. Whereas Susan B. Anthony, she got there, and when Susan B. Anthony got there, she thought she was going to be turned away, and then she wasn't turned away. And so like she just ran with it. I believe Sojourner attempted to vote, but didn't actually follow through and was not able to actually vote.
Okay. Well, thank you again so much for your help with this program and sharing your knowledge, insights, and research with our alumni and our community members. We really appreciate your willingness to do so. As we learned, today marks a significant milestone within our history in the fight for equality. And I think it's important to pause and reflect on all the hard work and sacrifice that so many have made so that we have the opportunity to vote. And obviously we have a long way to go, but we've at least come from somewhere. So thank you for helping us reflect on that struggle and that progress.
Totally. If anybody wants to have a Zoom coffee and talk more about this type of stuff, hit me up. I feel bad for not hearing from everybody in the audience and everything you think, but like I'm totally available to nerd out with anybody.
Well, thank you for that, Malia. I'd also like to thank all of you for who've joined us for this program. I appreciate you taking the time to learn more about this important part of our nation's struggle for equality. We hope you enjoyed the program. And as I mentioned earlier, Malia was very kind to help us with a JCU junior program focusing on the suffragettes. And I will be sharing that link as well as the link for this recording later this week with all of you, so you have it for your viewing pleasure. Finally, tonight marks the start of the fall term for our Alumni Continuing Education Series. Later this fall, we'll explore topics ranging from the beer and brewing industry, space exploration with an alumnus and astronaut Carl Walls, an in-depth look into how we honor our nation's history, specifically about the Confederacy and all of that goes into it, the beauty of life and resurrection in art. And finally, something I think we're all paying attention to, the 2020 election. And that one will feature CBS political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns from the class of 2009. You can learn about and register for all these programs at jcu.edu/alumni. Registration for many of these should be up within the week. Thank you again. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. And we hope you enjoy the program. We see you again in the future, and please stay safe. Have a wonderful night.